We might begin. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this Monday evening, Introduction to Buddhist Meditation. And we're going to begin with a meditation. And it's going to be on the breath, as previous weeks, and we're going to flow seamlessly into awareness of the body, awareness of feeling, awareness of the mind, and awareness of phenomena, and back again to the breath. So we can really consider the breath our main object, but all of these four spheres or realms of awareness are unified by the common factor of mindfulness. The quality of mindfulness that we're bringing to bear to each of those four spheres is the same. It's just that what's changed is the object. And this is very, very significant, because if we can develop and enhance our quality of mindfulness in our meditation, we'll find that it's a facility, a resource that we'll have in our daily life. We can become mindful more acutely, more vividly, more precisely of the experiences and phenomena that are arising from moment to moment in our daily lives. In other words, mindfulness isn't a quality that we need just have in meditation, but unless we get a taste for it, we'll find it very difficult to gather our mindfulness wherewithal in the busy times. The other great advantage of training in mindfulness is that when we are very ill, for example, we can meditate because we'll have developed the skills and the ability to do that in a very comfortable and relaxed fashion. And so it becomes an extraordinary resource that no one can take away. It's an interior resource, a very, very deep resource. And just knowing that's there as a kind of place that we can occupy, a spaciousness of our own being, changes our sense of confidence. We become more brave, more courageous, because we're no longer uncertain or unsure as to what or how we're going to respond to our experiences as they occur, even extreme ones. So I just throw that your way. You know, we often find ourselves in very, very difficult emotional circumstances, for example, and it might seem counterintuitive to think that we could in any way bring mindfulness to bear in that moment of sort of traumatic emotional crisis. But indeed we can. And Shantideva, the great Buddhist saint, says that if we can bring awareness to the mind of anger, for example, in its initial phase of generation, it's the most remarkable thing, because we can stop that trajectory of the strengthening mind of anger in its tracks, in a single gesture. And so he gives the analogy here of if there's a spark, beginning of a flame on a bed of straw, a house of straw, he calls it, if we step on that spark, we can prevent the fire. So this is equivalent to stepping on this beginning of a disturbing emotional mind, such as anger, in the very first moments, because we have the wherewithal of mindfulness to swing in, and then we apply a remedy. And in a very important sense, even the ability to become mindful itself of that beginning or nascent anger is already a remedy. Because one of the things that happens when we're very, very anxious, very upset, as we know, is we even forget who and what we are. We forget what we're saying. We forget who we normally are. We become potentially a monster, even to ourselves. How many of us have had that experience of becoming very, very upset with someone we love, abused them out of that upset, and maybe done grievous damage. There's a beautiful poetic image I came upon the other day which referred to the exit wounds of a misdirected word. Isn't that remarkable? The exit wound of a misdirected word. A single word can assassinate someone just as effectively as a bullet. And so where does that come from? It comes from this incredible pith of rage. And so we look back on that moment a day later and we're appalled at that creature that acted so violently, so viciously, so cruelly. And Buddhism is saying there's not much point going to sort of a cycle of shame and regret and so forth. Of course, that maybe has some value. Much more effective not to have gone there in the first instance. So how do we develop the techniques to begin to do this? So I just mentioned this, that mindfulness isn't, even though itself is a neutral mind, it opens us out to identifying the states of mind that are arising and appearing to it. And this is extraordinarily powerful. It also means, as I've suggested in previous weeks, that we might have another technique for dealing with fear and even pain, because one of the first things we do when we feel fear is that we clench and we try to build some bulwark or wall or fence. We try to quarantine ourselves from this force that seems to be pressing down upon us overwhelmingly. And so there's a Herculean battle being set up of forces there. And it's incredibly upsetting, incredibly disturbing, this kind of battle. And it's exhausting. And again, we can behave very unskillfully when we're under this kind of pressure. And so if we're merely mindful of that fear in that moment, we can see and experience it as maybe not the awesome, dangerous, all-conquering power from beyond that it appears to be. It somehow is accommodated and is allowed to subside in its place. This idea of things subsiding in their place is really particular to a meditational language, because we don't need the anger to go anywhere else other than to subside where it's appearing. We just let it come to rest. This is a very profound meditation instruction. There are other things we can do around that idea to help that emotion subside. But sometimes we can simply decide to substitute the negative trajectory, the fear or the anger or whatever it is, with a positive thought, a mere thought. And so that thought can disrupt. And so I've introduced at some length over the course of the previous weeks the meditation on friend, enemy and stranger. And that's a very powerful preliminary technique, because it proposes that when our friend is appearing as our friend, we have a certain intimacy and feeling of concern, need to protect them and so forth. When our enemy is appearing, we have the opposite experience. So if in that moment of beginning to apprehend the enemy, starting to feel enemy experience coming on, think they are my dearest friend. Even if they're not my dearest friend at this moment, they could be my dearest friend in a year or a month or a minute or a day. And even Buddhism's going to propose in a very, very expansive way that they may be my friend in my next lifetime. In fact, my enemy of this lifetime, my most bitter enemy, might be my dearest friend in my next lifetime. My stranger of this lifetime might be my dearest friend, and so forth. And so there's a circulation going on here which is open. And the only thing that's not open is my desperate, brittle efforts to freeze frame friend, enemy and stranger into concrete realities that correspond with my projection from ignorance for the stranger, attachment for the friend, and anger, hatred for the enemy. So this is the challenge, that those three states in our being project outwards. And so we're going to talk about this a little bit later, if we have time this evening, because there's a particular subtle series of stages that occurs for that to happen. And so Buddhism is going to identify that at the base of this process of projecting unskillfully is a fundamental misreading, not just of the reality of ourself, but the reality of the world that we perceive. So we begin to explore how to work with the very building blocks of what's already here on the cushion, and that by changing and transforming that, we then experience a different world. So we don't have to change the world, we have to change our minds, in other words. So I'm just going to, as the preliminary for the meditation, read out a little section of text from Matthew Ricard, who's a Western scientist who became a Buddhist monk in the Sakya tradition and spends an enormous amount of time meditating in the Himalayas. And he's been the subject of a number of scientific tests, having electrodes put on his cranium and so forth to register his brain waves while meditating. And one of the findings, I just mentioned this in passing because he's speaking from deep experience here, not just as a meditator, but also as a scientific research participant. What they find when the person who's meditating, when that person is contemplating great compassion, and great compassion here is not just caring about my loved one, I love you greatly, I want you not to suffer greatly. Great compassion spreads that onto every single being without exception. That's why it's great, because there's an infinite number of beings and this compassion cares for each and every one expansively, without limit. This remarkable thought, to have a compassion like that, when it's invoked in the meditator, is said to illuminate the entire brain electromagnetically. It just lights up on the screen. The scientists can't find a particular area of the brain that is more activated at that moment than another area. What kind of global activity here? So it's fascinating, isn't it, that this expansive, compassionate thought, considering the well-being of all, is accompanied by this very, very diffuse, powerful kind of activation of neurological activity within the human brain. So the scientists still don't know what to do with this kind of information, but they're kind of becoming more and more aware of the significance of exploring internal experiential states scientifically and beginning to try to work out more what it means to meditate. Because we have here, as we know, a notion coming out in modern Western psychoscience of neuroplasticity. We all know this idea, don't we? That if we habituate to a positive thought, it actually actively rewires the neurological pathways and patterns. And so the meditators have been neurologically plasticizing at a radical level of advanced direct technique for many, many, many centuries. So it's only now that science is sort of clambering to get some grasp of what might be going on. So we can relate this to trauma and all sorts of things in a very, very illuminating way as well. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I'm going to be quoting from Matthew Ricard on compassion as the motivation for the meditation. So I'm going to read his very beautiful passage quietly at the beginning. So just locate our spot. I was a sort of a late hippie child, not real hippie. I was a little bit too young to be a real hippie. I was on the tail end of the hippie era. but I was still influenced by Carlos Castaneda, some of us will know. And his sort of teacher in those Castaneda books spent a lot of time telling his students to find your spot. And the spot was that spot upon which one sat. So if you think of the enormity of this globe called Earth, at the moment there's this one little locale, which is the one that's immediately underneath us. It's already remarkable, isn't it? Out of the whole enormity of the world, there's only this little tiny space occupied by this body right now. And so when I say find your spot, just become aware that you're actually sitting here on this spot right this minute. This is your reality now. So you come home to that. So as you do this, you might wish to extract your mind from the daily concerns, no matter how demanding or overwhelming. And just for a few cycles of in and out breaths, just let any tension in the body go with the out breath in the form of smoke, which dissolves, tumbles away, never to return. And with the immediate in-breath, radiant light pours into our body as might nectar into a vase, dislodging tension, tiredness, stored in the body, which then leaves again with the out-breath in the form of smoke. So just do this cycle of visualising in order to bring an initial relaxation to the body. Now we do the same with the mind, just letting go of any anxieties, worries, heavy thoughts. And inhale their opposite in the form of radiant light, which floods into our awareness, illuminating it. Now we can do some cycles in the same way of smoke out and radiant light in, but without distinguishing or needing to distinguish between the body and the mind. Just feeling that any residual tiredness, tension and so forth is dissolved and replaced by awareness, gentle, open awareness. So as we do this, just simply become aware of our sitting on our spot. Right here, right now. allow ourselves to be here. And now to soften our mind for the meditation, we contemplate, quoting from Mathieu Ricard, I think it might be a bit unfair to view compassion as merely a pleasant experience, because compassion and fulfillment are highly intertwined. Human qualities often come in a cluster. Altruism, inner peace, strength, and freedom, and genuine happiness grow together like the various parts of a nourishing fruit. Selfishness, animosity, and fear come together as the parts of a poisonous plant. The best way to become truly compassionate is out of wisdom, by deeply realizing that others do not want to suffer just like you, and want to be happy just as you do. Consequently, you become genuinely concerned with their happiness and suffering. Helping others may sometimes not be pleasant, in the sense that you might have to deliberately endure some unpleasant hardship to help someone. But deep within is found a sense of inner peace and courage, and a sense of harmony with the interdependence of all things and beings. So that's the end of the quote. So just allow ourselves for a moment to contemplate this interdependence of all things and beings. And now we merely alight the breath, observing the breath coming and going, not controlling the breath, but merely observing. We're aware of an in-breath, we're aware of an out-breath, we're aware of the space between. We're aware of the beginning, middle and end of an in-breath, the beginning, middle and end of the space before the out-breath, and the beginning, middle and end of the out-breath. We're in constant contact with the flow of the breath. We remember from moment to moment to be aware of the flow of the breath. So the reason I said a light, because it is like resting a feather on the wind. So just let the gentle touch of our awareness, our mindfulness, ride upon the flow of the breath. Not losing contact for even 1 second. If the mind has wandered, bring it back to the breath. Pick it up and return. No fuss, no ado, simple remedy. Just checking, are we mindful of the breath? Now, in the same simple, direct manner, substitute the breath with the body. Merely observe the body, the awareness of the body that's here. Stay with that awareness from moment to moment, just as we did the object of the breath. If you find it difficult to locate body awareness, we can start with one part of the body, the hand or the foot or the knee or whatever, and then just radiate outwards until the whole body is included. Within that general arena of body awareness, of course, some particular bodily sensations connected to particular parts of the body will become prominent or fade. But just allow these incidents to occur within the general spaciousness of awareness of the body, just as we might waves on the ocean. Now we substitute the body with feelings. Feelings may be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, just as we did with the body. Just allow whatever feelings arise to arise, have duration and subside in their own way. So we're not producing feeling or controlling feeling or blocking feeling. This is vastly different to the approach we normally have to feeling. In this meditation, we're simply allowing it to be. Of course, if the feeling is unpleasant, we might begin to become fidgety or even panicky. But just gently relax and open to the feeling, just as it is. Just be aware. Now we substitute feeling with the mind, awareness itself. As we focus on awareness, we might find that we experience thoughts, strong thoughts, feelings or emotions. A whole range of activities can occur. But all of these activities appear to awareness, and in that sense, they're in the nature of awareness. A thought or a feeling doesn't obscure or block out awareness. It manifests within awareness, is of awareness, and dissolves into awareness. So if we just maintain awareness as our primary focus and allow these experiences to come and go as they might. And in the last mindful awareness or establishment, we substitute the mind or awareness with phenomena. Here we can just include any phenomena that appears to our awareness. We become aware that it's appearing. So there's a slight shift of focus here. In the last portion of the meditation, we're focusing on bare awareness itself. Here we're allowing whatever appears to that awareness to be the subject or the main focus of our meditation. It might be sound, a twinge in the knee, a feeling of pressure on our cushion, a memory of what we did yesterday, etc., etc., etc. Just be open to whatever phenomena appears. Now we step backwards, carrying mindfulness to awareness as our primary focus. Feeling, the body, the breath. We'll spend a little time on the breath. Now we can let go of the breath as our object and just quietly become aware again of our location in the room. We can wriggle, stretch, whatever we need. It's possible to do all these meditations with our eyes open. There are different traditions, of course, and even within traditions are different moments where we might choose to do that. One of the great advantages of meditating with our eyes open is that it's much harder to become sleepy or slothful, heavy. But if we have our eyes like this, it's kind of two extremes because we're emphasising the visual data, which isn't the purpose of the meditation. So if we do meditate with the eyes open, we simply allow light to enter. So it's a sort of soft, unfocused gaze, and it's recommended we can sort of imagine that we're peering down the sides of our nose to a point about 1 metre away, and we can keep the eyes lids slightly lowered but not shut, just enough. So you can experiment with that in your own time. Yes?
I was listening to a gentleman recently that you may know from heard of called Galong Tutsin, and he recommends that you meditate with your eyes open because it keeps you in the moment more.
Yes. Have you tried?
I have tried.
Yeah.
Sort of half open.
Yeah.
Just on a particular maybe candle or something
And you enjoy that, or
Still enjoy
benefit? Yeah.
It's different to having your eyes closed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a problem which I mentioned on the first night in meditation, particularly in single-pointed meditation, of sinking. Sinking, it's a bit like, gives you images of sort of walking to a quagmire and sort of disappearing in stages, doesn't it? But it's kind of like that. It's that feeling in meditation when you go, and then the snoring starts. So you've slid, you've sunk in incremental stages into a state of unawareness. It might be relaxing on one level, but it's not pertinent to the task of meditating. So there's a distinction here between relaxation and sometimes Western modes of relaxation meditation and the Buddhist and often Hindu and other traditions of meditation, where the emphasis is on alertness, clarity, precision, awareness. It's anything but that heavy, slumbering inertia. So sinking isn't technically sleep, but it's that kind of almost subliminal dropping out of awareness. So who's had that experience when they meditated? It's very common. And sometimes we barely get out of it when we try to meditate. It's like clambering to the surface of a very deep sea to even get a few moments of sort of clarity. So in those sorts of situations, it's often recommended we simply get up and do something briskly for a while and then attempt to return or decide to return to our cushion. Because if we force ourselves, we push too hard, it's not going to be very, very comfortable or beneficial. The opposite of sinking, and it's as common and as tricky, is excitement. And I mentioned that on the first night as well. And excitement here isn't sort of, oh, great, I'm going to the pictures tonight, because that's sort of obvious excitement. It's a more subtle problem. It's when the mind gets lured and dragged towards a desire object. And you might think I'm talking sort of metaphysics here, but I'm not. Because a desire object for the sake of this experience will be any attractive thought that claims our principal attention. How many of you had a major thought that claimed your awareness in that meditation? Innumerable times, no doubt. That's called excitement. And it's a form of distraction that causes us to sever contact of awareness with the object of the meditation. And so it's a seduction, in other words. So sometimes we find ourselves relishing a daydream that seems to be cinematic in its grand scale, more so than at any other time in the day. It's wondrous how vivid this memory is. And so we enter the narrative, the compulsive narrative of that memory, and we can find ourselves spending 5 minutes following that trajectory without having remembered that we're meant to be on the breath. So anyone have that experience? They went somewhere else. They looked to me, if I'd looked, it looked like you're meditating, but you weren't even here. You were outside this room for starters, and you weren't even in the present moment. You were tracing back or even projecting forward, because anxiety, as we know, is often connected to the past, but we're also projecting anxiety into the future. So it's very difficult to be simply here. So we have to learn a balance between these two extremes, sinking and excitement. And the Buddha gave the analogy of tuning a lute or an oud. You know, that's a beautiful classic instrument. And if you tighten the strings too tightly, you twang, you create this brittle resonance that's completely unmusical. It's stressed, it's overstressed, it's going to break, snap. This is excitement. If you loosen too much, if you relax too much, you take it too easily in the meditation, you don't put enough effort into it, you're going to sink. And that's like just loosening the strings until they just slack. and you can't even produce a vibration from them. No resonance whatsoever. So we have to steer between the two. And so the mind that steers is called discriminating awareness, and that evaluates from time to time whether our attention, our mindfulness is too tight or too loose, and then it applies a remedy. It tightens it, ratchets it up a little, or it winds it down a little bit, depending on what's necessary. So it's like steering three-dimensionally. So this is sort of like a basic grammar or architecture of a meditation. It's very good to have some of these terms to use, like discriminating awareness and mindfulness, the object of meditation, sinking, excitement, and so forth, because it helps to give a framework for our practice. So I've only got a little bit of time, and I wanted to jump onwards. So I'm just going to mention a few things about compassion. And I'm going to quote Matteo Ricard again, because I think this is and it's a classic image that he's giving from the Buddha's sutras. He says, as far as Buddhism is concerned, extending altruistic love to all certainly does not come at the cost of neglecting one's own children. This isn't, I'm just sort of interrupting here, this isn't an idle worry. Because when I presented the friend, enemy and stranger meditation, it might have seemed that the meditation was setting up a very powerful critique against having friends, because I described the friendship category in terms of attachment. So Buddhism here is going to be very, very, very careful to define our terms. Attachment has the aspect, this is quite shocking, attachment has the aspect that the object, in this case the person, gives me pleasure, what I want, satisfaction, fulfillment, etc. They, as an object, serve me, and that makes me happy. The great test of whether it's attachment or not is what happens when that person, i.e. that object, ceases to deliver the goods. What do we do? There's a transactional thing occurs here. We push them either into the enemy camp, if they really let us down by not delivering, or we just simply wipe them out, rub them out until they've got no features. That's the stranger. So that's attachment. Buddhism says that love has the exact opposite aspect, because it wishes that the other has happiness, irrespective of me. This is radical, a radical irrespective of me. My wish for you to be happy isn't contingent on whether I'm happy or not, because it comes from a very deep and open space which recognises and wishes your happiness as a wonderful goal. It can give that wish to you without having to preserve it or cling to it selfishly as some gain for myself. So I've got a book here. I don't think I'm going to go into it, but it's rather attractively called Traumatic Narcissism, Relational Systems of Subjugation. And it's a fascinating read, let me tell you. And the author has arisen from his own experience in a religious cult. I won't go into detail, but the religious cult involved a particular leader who claimed not to need anyone else because he was enlightened, but insisted on monitoring the behaviour of a whole array of disciples. And when those disciples didn't respond in the appropriate fashion, they were exorcised or eliminated from the community of followers. They were punished. All this is doing, as Daniel Shaw explains in this book, was this particular setup of the cult was acting out the kinds of structures of domination and subjugation that are occurring in so many of our families as we speak, so many of our relations. We subjugate someone when they oppose our will. And if they're weak enough, we'll eliminate any potential that they have for having an intersubjective relationship. We'll even deny them a voice. This is something that a lot of theorists in post-colonial studies have explored in a very, very deep way. You know, can the subaltern speak? Can the colonial victim actually have a voice in a colonial regime? Are they allowed to speak, let alone speak equally? Do they even have a language? You know, we talk about tribal sort of people, you know, in early colonial accounts speaking gibberish. The word gibberish is a haunting and horrific term to explain the alienation of someone else's profoundly vast language system into a series of sort of imbecilic utterances to me, because my language is superior, it's supreme, and it automatically consumes yours as worthless from that position of might or power. So, you know, we can look at this from any number of different angles, but there's some very moving tales in here of, I'll just read a little section for interest. Benjamin's use of the word complementarity to stand for the breakdown of intersubjective relatedness into domination submission strategies for control was exactly the link I was looking for in thinking about traumatic narcissism. These narcissists seek hegemonic subjectivity, the opposite of intersubjectivity. The victim of the traumatising narcissist, I argue, is often, I won't go there. What is developmentally traumatic is the narcissistic caregiver's rejection of the child's subjectivity and the caregiver's refusal to allow intersubjective recognition to be mutual. Mutual. So how many people here have come or had experience of an abusive relationship where they, I didn't mean, I mean, thank you, but a lot of us have. And in that, this domination, this narcissistic domination involved the denial of our ability to be intersubjective, to even have that relationship as a reciprocal relationship, let alone from that position to be awarded the right of reply. Shut up. You said that yesterday. To stay in your space, don't complain. You're where you're meant to be for me. That is the relationship that you have, and I am going to maintain that at all costs, even if it turns you into a victim or a slave. This is horrific mentality, but we're kind of doing it in all sorts of lesser grotesque ways a lot of the time, because it's really in important ways describing the ego, the self-cherishing ego, which is going to claim its space. So Buddhism wants to dig into this much more and try to locate the kinds of formational operations that empower this kind of self-centeredness. Buddhism isn't going to say, oh, we're self-centred because we're a weak and hopeless, unloving person. It's going to argue in a much more interesting way that we all have this problem unless we begin to work with it because of the way in which we're misreading reality. So I'm just going to introduce something that is quite subtle, and it requires a great deal of investigation. Through ignorance, and Buddhism proposes that this ignorance is an innate ignorance. It's not the product of philosophical learning. This ignorance, which is here, we have, superimposes an intrinsic findability onto this mere I. So what's a mere I? I have a body here, I have a mind. This body and this mind are not your body and aren't your mind. So you've got a mind, you've got a body, I've got a mind and I've got a body, but this one is suitable to label I. That one is suitable to label other than I, i.e. you. Your you, I, is labelled to your body and mind. And I see it as other to me. So this idea of mere I is a very powerful and effective way, vitally important and useful, to describe me. So we're not having a problem that I exist, but in dependence on this one, this ignorance superimposes an intrinsic findability, which is another way of saying that I really believe that this I sits here in and of itself, independently of any other phenomena for its support. It rises up from where it appears to be and addresses the universe from a position of central power. And it's this clinging to this superimposed I in this way that enables me then to label you friend, enemy and stranger with such vehemence, such vengeance, if you like. Because I really believe that you are a stranger to this very solid me. You're not just a stranger to this very solid me, you're a very solid stranger to this very solid me. And so one of the radical implications of friend, enemy and stranger meditation is that we begin to break down the kind of fixedness of the way in which we're superimposing an intrinsic findability onto the I. And so the gestation of this is that when we've superimposed this intrinsically findable I onto the mere I, they become mixed inextricably. So we don't distinguish that the superimposed I is somehow on top of the mere I. We just simply see a real I, a real I here, and a real other than I there. And so one of the other potentials of the friend, enemy and stranger meditation is that me, I can be friend, enemy and stranger in your meditation, because your relation to that is completely different. So there's a kind of intersubjective flow going on in reality that we're not allowing to be aware, ourselves to be aware of. So on the basis of this, we discriminate between an inherently existent I and an inherently existent other. We generate attachment for this I, we crave happiness for this I, and then we see the world as a resource for the happiness of this I. And that involves seeing others as a resource for me. This is the greed that I was describing before. And so we become obscured in this manner. So seeing things, possessions, bodies, resources and so forth, we start to think, what can this be for me if I possess it? So I just wanted to, I've got a really nice little quote here. I was thinking about this topic during the week, how to illustrate it, and I stumbled upon an article on the mega wealthy in America have taken to buying up huge swathes of the Californian coast. And I'll just read this section. The Wilkses, who now own some 700,000 acres across several states, have become a symbol of the out-of-touch owner. In Idaho, as their property has expanded, the brothers have shuttered trails and hired armed guards to patrol their acres, blocking and stymieing access not only to their private property, but also to some privately owned areas. This has drawn the ire from everyday Idahoans who have hiked and hunted in these hills for generations. Among the nation's top landowners are Mr. Maloney with 2.2 million acres in New Mexico, Colorado and other states, the media mogul Ted Turner with 2 million acres in Montana, Nebraska and elsewhere, Peter Bucker, founder of Subway, Charles and David Koch, who run cattle outside of Lubbock, Texas, and Jeff Bezos, Amazon fame, who operates his space company from a West Texas outpost. William Bruce Harrison, the scoin to an oil fortune, now owns 19 mountains in Colorado. So it's kind of fabulously comical, but I was thinking that really is just the ego writ large, because the locals are no longer allowed to go on their treks through the forests because it suddenly has a big sign saying private property, do not trespass, manned by armed guards. And so that's what we do when we set up this self-sufficient kind of intact, inherently existent ego, and something intrudes that we don't want, in come the armed guards, up come the do not touch signs, etc., etc. We are doing exactly the same governmental stuff on a tiny little micro level here. I might own 7 mountains in Colorado, but I've got my equivalent in my other collection, whatever it is. We all gather and collect in some way. So it's sort of fascinating to look at these topics from this sort of point of view. And so we're trying to develop techniques for reciprocity in our meditation, to try to begin to have some communication between the inside and the outside. So are there any questions or reflections that have risen, been stirred? Yep.
I just wanted to ask, because what you're saying around the issue of I,
Yeah.
to me it sort of seems a bit different from the stuff I heard in the first week or two I was here, when we were reflecting upon reincarnation, where the emphasis seemed to be on there was, in a sense, a real you, a real I, and it might have merit or might not have merit.
Yeah.
And there was importance to how that I passed from this life.
Yeah. Yes.
The next life.
Yeah.
Can you just comment on
Well, it's a very important point. Sort of in my very, very brief, and it's alarmingly too brief presentation because I'm only able to touch on it, I did say that we have no problem with the mere I. It's the mere I that goes from lifetime to lifetime. It's fascinating, isn't it? In this lifetime, there was a point of time when this little mere I could be held in the palm of our mother's hand. This little baby was me. This one. If I follow this continuum back, there's a little baby that could be held in the hand. That body isn't the same body as I've got now, but this is the continuation of that body. This mind isn't the same mind, but it's a continuation of that mind. Buddhism proposes that those processes go before birth and after birth continuously, in dependence on that continuity of very subtle mind with a very subtle body, we can label I to this one, you, and so forth. So we're not denying that there's a person. Yeah, but I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about the attempt to arrest the flow of that mere I and turn it into something which is monolithic and fixed and absolutely determined to have its way, even if it involves punching and hurting and ravaging the universe and the world of people, such as a moment of anger.
You might describe it as preserving a false self. Is that another way of describing it?
Yes,
Yeah.
and that preserving of a false self is a more or less endlessly desperate procedure, because it's a folly at the most profound level, because it's based on a misrecognition of what the I is. And so I mentioned in the first week the idea of the body, why we're doing this mindfulness of the body, just to sort of swing it back to the other meditation. And I just want to touch on something else here. Peter Singer, we all know of, I think, the famous utilitarian philosopher and famous as an animal liberationalist theorist. He writes, in an earlier book called The Expanding Circle, I discussed the view that no one ever acts ethically. There I suggested that every blood donor who gives blood to strangers without any reward beyond an indifferent cup of tea and a biscuit redeems human nature from the denigration of its cynical critics. What a lovely passage that is. Because I mentioned in the first week that I am the subject of multiple blood transfusions. I wouldn't be here for that. But I'm even more remarkable in that I'm a living chimera or chimera in the Greek. I have 2 sets of DNA. I have someone else's stem cells producing my blood and my immunity. And that was transplanted to me in an organ transplant from a donor in England whom I have never met. And I'm not allowed to know her name unless I go through an elaborate freedom of access or, process of formal access. But I did manage to contact them, and I thanked them, of course, from the very bottom of my heart for giving me the gift of extra life. And she replied, well, that's what you do, don't you? So, look, I'm just confessing, I've spent years of meditation to get to that point. I had my miraculous doppelganger over in Wales who had come to the same compassionate realisation of the need to give what you can for the happiness of the stranger, purely from the very core of her heart. It was so extraordinary, a gift to give back to me. Not to give me the gift of her stem cells, but to give me that piece of spiritual advice was really, really wondrous. And so the very decision to give blood is remarkable, because you don't know where that blood's going to go. It might be turned into blood product, which can maybe help 1,000 haemophiliacs, for example, and so forth. And so there's all sorts of issues here. And I was just going to raise a little tantalising story. I have a friend whose friend whose friend was in a marriage, and the husband's the kidney was failing. Kidneys were failing, and he got his wife. He was a very manipulative man. He pressured his wife to give a kidney, and she agreed. Their relationship had been in some trouble prior to this, but nonetheless she agreed. The transplant went ahead, he recovered, then he divorced her, and now he's remarried. I just raised this story because it seems a little bit ungracious, doesn't it? And so my friend who told me this story said that his peer group have ostracised him as punishment for being such a mean bugger. That's a perfect example of traumatic narcissism, isn't it? Organ narcissism. Yeah.
What you were going to say, you were going to ask him to get him back.
So I'll just touch on one thing before we finish. That friendly stranger meditation also doesn't mean that we have to lay down and be a victim. If we're being attacked, we can resist, but we do that with skill and compassionate accuracy. So we can disarm someone, we can knock them unconscious if we need to stop them from killing us, etc., etc., etc. So we're not saying that we have to become passive and inert, but that we don't operate out of vengeance and cruelty and this need to have an ongoing retribution. So it doesn't have to be out of control, in other words. So let's finish there, and I'll just invite us to give away any benefits of the session. I'm going to read a little section out in the form of a dedication. This is from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. The ultimate goal or the purpose of our living is not just to obtain happiness for oneself, that living being who is oneself, but not just to solve one's own problems. Life is not just for that. Our life, our precious life, this precious human body that we have, is not just for that. The ultimate goal of our life, or the meaning of our life, is each of our lives is to pacify other beings who are experiencing undesirable sufferings, to free them from their undesirable sufferings, to obtain happiness for them, that which is what they are looking for or what they desire, to free everyone from all the sufferings and to offer happiness to everyone, the numberless, the others who are numberless, living beings. So thank you very much, and Damien will be taking the cushion next Monday, and the program rolls on, so feel free to stay for tea and coffee in the diner.